and welcome to the Oddity Archive, the show that loves silent films so much that it largely confines it to videotape. No one ever said we were above hypocrisy around here. Anyway, as implied, yes, it is time for our annual silent film episode to tie in with Silent Movie Day, September 29th. Now, this year I have other projects, more pressing projects going on, chiefly finally getting the Oddity Archive soundtrack album out the door, which has just been in the pipeline for far too long. And of course, we're coming up on Halloween here, which is never fun in archive land. And as such, I need to slim this one down a bit. Hopefully next year we can do something a little more substantial again. But anyway, as far as today's episode goes, I figured just for a lark, we would go over some, funnily enough, oddities, Oddity Archive, that I've encountered over the years on cheapy and cheapy-ish public domain silent film issues, really primarily, if not entirely, on VHS and Betamax. So over the course of this episode, you will see and hear things like original soundtracks where you would not necessarily expect them, total soundtrack fails, surprise foreign prints of things, unauthorized period re-edits of things, TV prints, bootlegs, bootlegging the bootleggers, and so on and so forth. Now, as I said, this is all about stuff that I've encountered over the years. There is no way this could ever be definitive. So if you've encountered any kind of cool, quirky silent film stuff on whatever public domain VHS or beta or early DVD issues, feel free to share it in the comments. Since the dawn of home video, in the Betamax and VHS sense at least, the status quo for soundtracks on usually cheapy issues of public domain silent films is to just play some old ragtime or similar 78s for a comedy, or some classical music for most other genres. Whether or not the compositions and or recordings were public domain, all too often didn't matter. If nothing else, this is how I first heard Jelly Roll Morton when I was about 13 or 14 years old. Hello, symptoms, give me Dr. He's got what I need, I say have. But every now and then, companies would go the extra mile. Conversely, some companies cared so little that the needle drops are completely random, or occasionally they deliver a truly silent film. Heck, my oldest public domain tape from 1978 is truly silent. In the early days of home video, pretty much anything under $50 was considered budget line for a VHS or Betamax tape. As such, for a while, public domain distributors, whose tapes often still started at $30 to $40, would try to go the extra mile by giving consumers an original soundtrack. The most famous of these came by way of Video Yesteryear, aka Video Images, and Real Images, and Radio Yesteryear, and Radiola. Anyway, Yesteryear, to speak generically, mostly dealt in old-time radio reissues. But when home video came along, Yesteryear was one of the first, starting in 1978. However, the bulk of their releases were of talkies and early TV kinescopes, and often unremarkable ones at that. While Yesteryear was very guilty of reusing Blackhawk's Prince of Silence, with some of their historical and restoration intertitles still intact no less, after a while, Yesteryear started commissioning new performances of scores. However, as implied, early on, the soundtracks tended to be needle drops with little to no relation to the movie. For example, my poor decrepit silent comedy classics tape uses some random Dixieland jazz album for a soundtrack. A live album at that. But starting in 1983 or so, Yesteryear would reach out to organist extraordinaire Rosa Rio to compile and perform some, if you will, new music for these films. Reportedly, Rio did over 350 soundtracks, granted largely for short films, for Yesteryear, of frankly varying degrees of quality. One of the very first companies to deliver silent film on home video was Hollywood Home Theater, established no later than 1980. And by the way, their spellings of the word theater are used interchangeably. Anyway, admittedly, the history on this company as of this episode is still pretty shaky and speculative, but in a nutshell, Hollywood Home Theater was an arm of Budget Video, seemingly a long-defunct video store in Hollywood, and the company was the brainchild of businessman slash Hollywood ephemera collector slash sometimes musician David Ichikawa, and seemingly the company was very much a one-man operation. As such, I guess it shouldn't be too surprising that Ichikawa was known to take the odd crack at providing new, original film scores, done entirely on probably a Mini Moog synthesizer and a 4-track tape deck. Given that seemingly all of Ichikawa's scores were for horror and sci-fi films, it's not too surprising that the scores tended to be on the minimalist and avant-garde side of things. Not to mention eerie as all hell. On the downside, it's a total crapshoot as to whether each tape has an original score on it. In the case of, at the very least, Hollywood Home Theater's issue of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, some copies have the original score, some have an existing generic needle drop score. Like my copy. Natch. Getting into the silence as a preteen and teen in the late VHS and early DVD era invariably meant only being able to afford the cheap stuff. As such, I was accustomed to the soundtracks being a bit random. This led to simultaneously becoming a bit more accepting of oddball scores, and to my habit of just giving up and throwing on some Pink Floyd or something if the provided, at times non-score, got on my nerves. So with that in mind, yeah, I'm not opposed to non-period appropriate music accompanying a silent film. It's when the composition itself clashes with the movie. So for me personally, within the realm of cheap public domain releases, it has to be astoundingly wrong. An honorable mention goes to my already archive infamous Madison 10-tape Charlie Chaplin box sets, in which an unauthorized later expanded edition of A Burlesque on Carmen from 1915 seems to actually use, granted I'm no expert, but use unrelated random parts of Bizet's Carmen opera. By the way, that particular issue had a synchronized score at one point, but it's left off in favor of said Carmen excerpts. But one truly colossal Madison fail of mine is another Chaplin one, just not on those box sets. It's from the first copy of The Gold Rush I ever owned. Now, that movie does have its more serious moments, but on this particular issue, the entire score alternates between organ dirges and fugues, both deathly serious. If nothing else, it turns the comic horror of parts of the movie into legit horror. My personal favorite soundtrack fail was already briefly touched on in last year's discussion of Metropolis. The 1986-ish Crown Movie Classics issue of that movie has a hilariously mismatched score. Coupled with the too-fast playback speed of the movie, it turns Metropolis's dystopian nightmare into an unusually dark Laurel and Hardy film. Come on, you knew this was coming. Anyway, weirdly enough, it's been my venerable Madison 10-tape VHS Charlie Chaplin collections that have supplied me with my most noteworthy, unique to cheap public domain materials. And when I say cheap, I mean it. These two sets sold for $20 a piece, new of course, at Media Play. Of course, when I purchased these sets back in the late 90s, I never would have guessed in a million years that they would have left me with such a bounty of material to draw upon for years and years to come. Now, at the time, my reasons for picking up these sets were twofold. One, most of Chaplin's original 1914 shorts for Keystone had never seen any real restoration, and sets like these were still the only option. And two, Chaplin's subsequent shorts had been restored by this point, but they were pricey and or out of print and or flat out non-existent at any of the video retailers in beautiful downtown Aurora. It's also worth noting that these two sets were available on DVD as well, at $30 to $40 a pop if memory serves. But regardless of the format, I still kind of felt like I was getting fleeced to some degree with these things. Each 10-tape set had about 9 hours of material on them, in EP mode. And of course, there were 10-hour blanks available back then. So yeah, it seemed like a lot of unnecessary bulk for relatively little content. But I digress. In no particular order, some of the goodies that appear on these sets are: Number 1, bootlegs and quasi-bootlegs. I already mentioned the presence of a lot of Jelly Roll Morton on the soundtrack to these tapes, which at the time, a lot of those recordings and compositions were under copyright, and in some cases still are. Though as of this episode, we are down to those last precious few years. Anyway, rather amusingly, some of this music is used on prints that were pilfered from Blackhawk Films' handful of S&A 1915 restorations which they did during the 70s. Number 2. Foreign prints. Almost always on the Keystone shorts, almost always French. Viva les Charlots, I guess. Number 3. A stray newsreel. If we ever think of Chaplin appearing in a newsreel, it's generally from a lot later, like the 40s and early 50s, during the real scandal-laden era. Having said that, it's not from a major outfit like Movie Tone, which actually didn't exist yet. This one is from the much smaller British Topical Budget newsreel company, which barely lasted beyond the silent era. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this has never appeared anywhere else. Number 4. Some stray 1920s and 30s reissue prints. Most frustratingly, the Mutual era stuff, 1916 and 17, seems to be sourced from the Van Buren prints, as they're known, which RKO had out in the early and mid-30s. Those are noteworthy because they contained then-new custom soundtracks, which, alas, are covered up here.
I'm the whining boy, don't deny my name. Fire! Fire! Help! Help! Fire! Help! Fire! Help! Fire!
Number 5. Unauthorized, fake, if you will, Chaplin shorts. I already mentioned a burlesque on Carmen, which appears in not only a later would-be sound reissue, but is in and of itself sourced from an expanded and partially remade version of the short, taking a normal two-reeler and bloating it to an unwieldy and really uncomfortable four-reeler. Another fake, if you will, Chaplin short, Triple Trouble from 1918, is cobbled together from an unreleased short, a released short, outtakes, and then new Chaplin-free, Chaplin unauthorized footage. This one has since been, despite its origins, restored. And lastly, number 6, my personal favorite, the, as of this episode, lone still circulating episode of the short-lived Charlie Chaplin Comedy Theater syndicated TV series, which only aired for a few months, first run that is, in 1965. This series took Chaplin's 1915 shorts for SNA, which had long since lapsed into the public domain, re-edited them somewhat, and were fitted with then new-ish stock music scores, and contained sporadic voiceover commentary from longtime WOR TV announcer Phil Tonkin. This one's already been posted in its entirety to the Archive Annex channel.
Produced in 1915, work begins in an upper-class house in the suburbs, in which Edna Proviance is the pretty maid, and Martha Golden is the harassed lady of the house. By tilting the camera to make the hill appear so steep, Chaplin, the director, creates a memorable sight gag for Charlie the Tramp. Gas leak or not, Billy insists on his hot breakfast before leaving for a hard day at the office. The gunshot makes the leaky gas stove explode, leaving Charlie's boss to cool off in the tub. Charlie emerges from his trapdoor safe and sound, having finished a good day's work.
Well, that's it for today's archive. Join me next time when I discuss retirement strategies. using public domain silent film VHS tapes as your main investment. Nobody ever said it would be a sound investment.